Hello, how are you? Welcome to my little video series that I call Crime Dive. My name is Crystal Sky, and if you're anything like me, you find yourself drawn to true crime cases. So, like many others out there, I've decided to make videos about it. If you also are drawn to true crime, and you want to feel better about your own makeup skills, you should absolutely like, subscribe, and let's hang out together every Tuesday, normally every Tuesday, where I will take a deep dive look into a true crime case while slapping on the old clown paint. So yeah, how are you? Welcome to part 4 of the Moody case. We are wrapping up our look at this case. Hasn't it been bizarre and wild and weird? Like, no wonder there's so many questions still left about it, you know what I mean? Thank you so much to Smash the Bug for dropping this case in my comments and letting me know about it. It has definitely been an interesting case to examine. And as a quick reminder, this was the book I read to get a bulk information of that I used for these videos. It's Saving Stacy, The Untold Story of the Moody Massacre, written by Rob St. Clair. We'll get just a little bit into him. He was part of the defense team who defended the Moody estate against the wrongful death claims, or suits rather. And yeah, thank you so much for putting up with my kind of flakiness lately. I know I've had trouble uploading regularly. This whole year has just been bananas and has just taken me in so many different directions. So yeah, thank you so much. Sorry this is also uploaded late. I am actually so far behind. I will actually be filming another video tomorrow so I can get back on schedule. There's just so much going on. And then we found out, I've been keeping y'all a little bit updated on our little pet drama. Well, I mean, Urza, my little black kitty, is fine. Everything's fine. But we took Vex, our husky, to the vet, and they found out she had a heart murmur. So yeah, now we gotta scramble and schedule an appointment with a cardiologist so she can get an echocardiogram and just kind of go from there. So yeah, we're wondering if maybe that's why she was abandoned. Yeah, I don't know. But yeah, it's definitely been a lot. I'm emotionally exhausted. So thank you so much for bearing with me. Okay, well, let's get on with part 4 of the Scott Moody case. Now, if you remember from last week, we ended with pedo pig Stout, right? He's now in front of a grand jury to find out if he's going to be indicted on everything that he did with Stacy. Good Lord, I can't talk. So yeah, we ended the video when the jury broke for a recess, all right? So we will pick up today's video with then reconvening and questioning Stout some more. And y'all, if you thought what he said last week was pretty bizarre and wild and you were just like, what the actual fuck? Oh man, we have so much more to get into. So many more quotes from Stout himself. Quotes. I can talk. Yeah, it's pretty wild. Again, this is why I love using quotes, because it's just outrageous that these people say these actual things. And this is before a grand jury who's going to decide if he's going to be indicted, by the way. It's amazing. And yeah, I've been saying this all throughout. Remember, this case is a lot of heavy adult themes. So yeah, like I said, Stout's before this grand jury talking about, assaulting Stacy. So yeah, just keep that in mind. Yeah, we're probably going to have some language drop in this one. So yeah, just be prepared for that. So yeah, let's pick up where we left off, all right? So yeah, they took a recess and now they're back in Stout before the grand jury. They're asking him questions. And then remember, the prosecutor who is prosecuting Stout and also, cross-examining him and stuff is Scott Longo. So yeah, let's just pick up with them reconvening, okay? Now, when they got back into session, oh my God, I said this at the beginning of the video, the tales and the things that Stout says is just mind-boggling, to say the least, all right? Now, when they got back, Stout then, attempting again to defend himself, then started rambling on about how he was being targeted. And he was being targeted through the Moody's by a criminal he had helped put away. And this is what Stout had to say to the grand jury about that. Quote, okay, I worked, these are just thoughts. I don't know if these are correct or not. To be straight up with you folks, as far as that goes, I had worked a very large case in Logan County. That being the Rosebrook case. Joe Rosebrook. It was my case. This was in the paper, Chop Shop King. This thing was extremely high profile. This man's got a very large, very, very large amount of money. So Stout then recounted for the jury how 2 years prior to this grand jury hearing happening, all right, 2 years prior to this, Joe from behind bars, because remember, Stout had put him behind bars, had hired a private investigator out of Columbus, and this investigator's name was Gary Phillips, okay? Now, Stout rambled on how he believed Investigator Phillips was like out to get him, and how he was watching him, watching his every move. Quote, I shouldn't say every single day. That's exaggerating. Sometimes I feel that way. He was putting stories out on the street that I'm involved with theft. I'm involved with all kinds of sexual issues. I'm involved with dealing. I've got all kinds of stolen property. Now, Stout then went on to claim that he had a prison informant. Okay. This informant was like keeping Stout up to date on Joe's movements behind bars. And the reason Stout had like an in-prison informant sort of updating him on all of Joe's moves was because Joe had supposedly put a hit out on Stout, $20,000, and an extra $5,000 if one of Stout's kids happened to also get killed. And so Stout told the jury, quote, so obviously I want to keep close dibs on this man and know what his moves are. Now, Stout then said that, because of prison politics and how easy it is to kind of like find out who's talking to the police, he couldn't directly contact this prison informant. He actually contacted this prison informant through yet another informant who was outside of prison. And it was this middleman informant who was sort of the liaison between Stout and this in-prison informant. I have said informant a lot in a short period of time. Stout continued, quote, 2 weeks prior to me being confronted on this Friday, the informant called my other informant on the street and said something's going on with John Stout. Joe Rosebrook's extremely excited. He's got him. He's finally going to get him. I've got hours of documented conversations from Joe Rosebrook and Ann Rosebrook, his wife, saying they are going to get me. It's going to happen. They've tried and paid people to set me up already. Now, already, I don't know if I was like, I don't know about you guys, but if I'm on the jury, and Stout is coming back after already not looking too good, in front of the jury, and now he's rambling on about some case he was involved in and how this ties into it, I would definitely be scratching my head thinking I don't understand where you're going with this. But let's continue on. So after Stout said that, Longo then asked Stout if he thought maybe Stacy had been a tool of Joe's. And Stout answered, quote, I don't know. Stacy Moody was really excited after these homicides took place, that she was going to be a millionaire. One of the big shots, because she would tell others, we're going to be millionaires. I'm going to get the whole estate. There's no one else left. I get all of the estate. But this family soon realized that if Scott Moody was the shooter, they're not going to be millionaires. This is $1 million property out on 47. It's 1,000 acres, but they're not going to be seeing that. That's going to these other 2 families of victims that were killed. And that's why the family became upset with the fact that Stacy had said that Scott did it. They didn't like that. And they were trying to influence her, and she discussed that with me to convince me that Scott was not the shooter. I have my concerns that if that family was paid the right amount of money, they would go forward and do this to me, because Joe Rosebrook is doing 10 years in prison for wanting to have a man killed and several other things. He made it very clear. He spent $150,000 on this private investigator to see that that's done. Gary Phillips, I'm being told, is investigating this matter for the Moody's, and the Moody's are being paid by the Rosebrooks. That bothers me. Gary Phillips is from Columbus. You should have nothing to do with this case that I'm involved with, unless it's to set me up. And that's when Longo sort of retorted, well, I myself am from Columbus. What's your point? And Stout just answered, quote, I appreciate your humor, but Gary Phillips is a private investigator from Columbus. I don't know how you'd even get hold of him, hire him to come and do a job for you. I find it very peculiar that he's working with the Moody family on some matters. And what would you guys be thinking if I was in the jury? If I was on the jury, I'd be so confused. I'd be like, bro, every word you say just makes you look guiltier and guiltier. All of a sudden bringing up this, Joe Rosebrook guy who you helped put away, and oh yeah, he's coming after me through the Moody's. It's so silly. And Longo then asked Stout, well, how do you know Investigator Phillips is, working for the Moody's? How do you know this, right? You can't just be making claims in front of a grand jury, right? Without some sort of proof or something, right? So Longo asked him, okay, how do you even know that the Phillips, Investigator Phillips is tied up with the Moody's? And Stout replied, quote, I received phone calls with reference to that. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong. Now, that was really suspicious to me. The way he used that wording, well, if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. So it's wait a minute, do you not have irrefutable proof? Or are you just using your position and authority to talk all this shit without anything to back it up? I thought that was so weird, the phrasing of the way Stout explained that. Because, right, who else knows knows how to say things so that legally you're not responsible for them, right? And so, it's kind of like the whole, oh, I don't recall. Oh, well, if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. I just received a phone call. Like, I don't know. That was super weird. Also, the fact, like, with the authority and the sureness that Stout is saying this, well, like, I know this Phillips guy is out to get me, and he's working with Rosebrook, and, that's why he's, working for the Moody's and shit. Like, it's, like, just, like, the way he says it as if it's, like, a fact. And it's like, well, where's your proof, though? Longo then cornered Stout on his inconsistency, pointing out that, like, okay, you claim Phillips is, like, stalking your every move, is following you around everywhere. And that the same guy, the same investigator, is now working with the Moody's. Quote, I find that a little bit odd that you would know that much about what the Moody family is doing, but you're saying somebody's looking over your shoulder telling you. It seems like somebody is looking over their shoulder telling you what's going on there, right? Because remember, Stout had already said that he wasn't supposed to have any contact with the Moody's, so Longo's like, how do you even know this? You're saying, like, this Phillips guy is, like, stalking you and following your every move, yet you seem to know, like, all these details about the Moody family. Maybe someone is telling you what their movements are, Stout said that it was an informant who was telling him all this, all right? And added that he was still keeping an eye on Joe Rosebrook's moves as well. Quote, I was told both that he was hired prior to this being divulged, and I was told he was brought in afterwards to assist in burying me, and he truly has tried to do so. So what I just said to you are two different scenarios in my mind. If I'm discredited by the Moody family, I bet if I asked Stacy Moody today, did you see Scott Moody shoot you? She would tell me no, and she told me about 5 times or more that he did. Longo then moved on to the case, all right, the Scott Moody case, and started questioning Stout on, like, just how quickly it had been closed down. Like, remember, it had been closed, like, the day it happened, pretty much. And Longo was questioning Stout about that. Quote, if Scott Moody's not the shooter, then you open a can of worms, and there's someone out there that did this. Maybe it's a gray-haired guy with a blue shirt, and that could cause the detectives at the sheriff's department problems because they closed it too soon. I mean, that could cause problems for a lot of people. Stout admitted that that was correct, and then tried just really hammering on the point that the reason the Moody's were so insistent that Scott wasn't the shooter was because of the wrongful death lawsuits brought about by Paige and Megan's families. And then he went on to, disparage the Moody's even more and decided to also be a sexist asshole on top of that, especially to Audrey. He talked about how, like, Steve and Audrey seemed to encompass, quote, reverse roles, where Audrey was more assertive and talkative and, like, dominant, whereas, Steve was more docile and quiet and submissive. What this has to do with anything that's being discussed, I don't know. And Stout then claimed that it was Audrey who was particularly upset that Stacy had said Scott was the shooter. But that's when Longo pointed out, like, wait a minute. Like, Audrey was super upset. She, Stacy kept saying Scott was the shooter, and, like, they're trying to convince her that Scott wasn't the shooter. Yet, wasn't it Audrey who kept contacting you and trying to get you to talk to Stacy? And Stout confirmed yes. And then Longo said, quote, you'd think if she had a problem with Stacy saying Scott did it, that she might stop calling the detectives investigating it. And that's when Stout then cut him off, saying, well, like, Stacy was such a pathological liar that nobody knew what Stacy was going to say from, day to day. And at this point, some jurors in the grand jury had some questions for Stout. And you can be the judge for yourself, because we'll read some excerpts, but I don't think it went too well for him. Now, one juror had a question about that comment that Stout had made about Stacy, like, going around saying that they were all going to be millionaires and stuff. So, like, the juror wanted, like, some clarification about that. So first, he asked Stout to confirm that, like, hey, like, can you confirm with us right now on the stand under oath that, like, Stacy did in fact say these comments to you? And Stout said, yes, she did. He would confirm that. And then when the juror asked, well, when specifically did she say this comment? Stout just replied with, quote, the whole time. And then, like, the juror asked him, like, well, what do you mean by that? What do you mean, like, whole time? And if it was indeed, like, whole time that Stacy was saying these things, quote, if you were a detective, it should be documented somewhere that she said that. And that's when Stout, I guess, got, like, really annoyed at this line of questioning. He was really annoyed at this juror. And apparently it kind of showed in his answer and the way he was, like, talking to them. Quote, what does that have to do with this case? And the juror, just replied, quote, well, I just want to know when she said that we were going to be millionaires, because then, as you were just recently talking, did you know? Was it just you? One of your assumptions or whatnot? Now we've got the Rosebrooks tied in with the Moody's. And, as you can see, right, like, the jurors were kind of confused as well. Like, aren't you a little confused about, like, what Stout was doing? Like, I remember when I was reading this in the book and I was like, what the hell is this guy talking about? Like, why is he talking about any of this? And it just sounds really bizarre, right? And outlandish. But Stout just replied to the jury, quote, "There's two different things I was trying to get out to you folks, to try and explain to you what's in my mind as to why this would be happening to me. Because remember, this was all happening to him, guys, okay? This was happening to him and he was being targeted." And, I guess the juror just responded and just like, okay, and kind of like a weird, like not really convincing tone, Now, apparently Stout caught on that he wasn't looking too good in the jury and he wasn't doing too well. So he added, quote, "Stacy and her dad and Audrey all talked about how this was $1 million property. As a matter of fact, her dad he talked pretty rudely about Kay in front of Stacy, and it was an uncomfortable thing. He made reference, Steve Moody said, 'You're going through a divorce, John, and you always wish your ex-wife gets run over by a semi. All of the pain would go away. We've all said that, haven't we, John?' Okay, no, but they talked openly in front of Stacy poorly about Kay. I thought we were discussing some comments Stacy supposedly made about being millionaires. How did this trail off into, they talked shit about Kay in front of her? Super bizarre, right? Another juror then asked if Stout had ever discussed the Rosebrook case with Stacy or the Moody's at all. I think they were really confused on why Stout brought up Joe Rosebrook, and they were trying to make the connection and see the connection. And Stout replied, quote, "I could have, yes. That was a very key part of my life." Again, just kind of interesting the way he answers, leaving it open, right? "Oh, well, I said this under oath, but I wasn't lying because, that's what I thought, I don't know. I just thought it was really weird the way Stout was answering some of these questions. And the juror asked Stout if he could say who had told him that the Rosebrooks and the Moody's had this connection and were conspiring together. But Stout said that he couldn't. Quote, I only restrained from saying to you who that person was because there's already been one man's life put at risk. Joe was charged with it. Joe was charged with setting up a murder for hire that I worked. I almost had him for a murder for hire against myself, but I wasn't able to pull it off. I am afraid that if I bring that name into this, there's a third murder for hire." And the juror was like, "Well, okay, but quote, well, if you have these assumptions that, which you've just explained, would you not go to your supervisor and, maybe I shouldn't be the detective on this case? Let me back off because I've got these thoughts." Yeah, basically saying wait a minute, if you thought Rosebrook was tied in any way to the Moody's, why would you keep working the Moody case, right? And Stout then corrected the juror and said, well, he only found out about the Rosebrook-Moody connection after he had been fired from the sheriff's office. He repeated that, the information that he had that Joe had gotten excited because he was finally going to get Stout. And Stout had to clear up that this was not when he found out about the Moody-Rosebrook connection. When he said that the informant told him that, Joe Rosebrook was all excited and all that. This is not when he found out that the Rosebrooks and the Moody's had a connection. Quote, "It wasn't until after I'm fired I'm thinking, God, was this it? This is when I get another phone call about Gary Phillips for my informant in prison. Gary Phillips is working with the Moody's. He's being paid by Jeff Rosebrook, which is Joe Rosebrook's brother, who is a millionaire, owned HBD in Bell Fountain here. Jeff is paying Gary Phillips to work the Moody case." And now we have Jeff Rosebrook involved, guys. Now we have Joe Rosebrook's brother involved, and this is how Stout found out they were working together. Can you even keep anything that Stout is saying here straight? No, of course not. That's what liars and deceivers do. They tell lie after lie, and then when they're called out on it, they got to create more lies to cover up those lies, And what's really amazing is that it's dude, you're supposed to be a police officer and you're not even a good liar. You've been a cop for how long? A detective for how long? And you don't even know how to properly lie? I don't know. Isn't it outrageous? Isn't it outrageous? But if you've never had to answer for anything you've done, if you've always gotten away with everything you've ever done, yeah, you probably wouldn't be too skilled at lying. So another juror then asked Stout, quote, "If you knew a private investigator was following you, hired by the Rosebrooks, you didn't think about being alone with Stacy? That may be a tool?" Damn, that's a good question, right? Stout said, no, that never even crossed his mind. And when the juror, wasn't buying that, it's wait a minute, what? What do you mean it never crossed your mind? They just were not buying anything he was saying. Stout said, quote, "There's more criminals in Logan County than we all care to realize, believe me." And the juror just retorted, quote, "I guess if I knew someone was watching my every move, I wouldn't put myself with a promiscuous 15, 16-year-old. Which just cracks me up, right? Because now they're using Stout's own words and testimony against him. Oh, Stacy was such a liar. Oh, she was such a skank and was so promiscuous. And it's wait a minute, you just said that this investigator's now watching your every move. Why would you have all these alone encounters with Stacy then, if that was indeed what was happening, right? But at this juror's question, this comment or whatever, Stout just shook his head and said, quote, "I'm in a position where I've got writers with me every day, female and male, adult and juvenile, and let me back that up saying that differently. Not every day. Commonly. And so, no, if you sit back here in hindsight and say, you know what, maybe it wasn't too smart. It's kind of like the old story. You arrest 10,000 people and you quit patting them down after 8,000. You just kind of get lax. You don't worry about that stuff. I wasn't thinking. This family's calling me almost daily. I wasn't thinking this was going to come up and be an issue. I really wasn't." Oh, I'm sure you weren't going to think it was going to be an issue, but for very different reasons. Another juror then asked Stout, quote, "I guess my other question is, I wrote this down at the beginning. What do the Moodys have to gain? If what Stacy's saying is not true, what do they have to gain? What are you thinking?" And I think that is an excellent question and what most people should ask, right? It's like, okay, if the victim of a sexual assault is lying, what do they have to gain, by like coming forward and being, put under this microscope and going under the scrutiny? And it's really interesting, and bizarre, of course, like with everything he's saying, how Stout replied, quote, "There's two different things. They're getting money from the Rosebrooks. Obviously, there's been $20,000, and this is almost, I was so close to having this thing locked up. The informant got scared and decided not to do it. There's $20,000 plus another $5,000 if one of my kids is set up, and that's documented. That's all documented in records. I'm not making this up. So what would these are people that you folks in here know. Take Rosebrook. There's all kinds of rumors about how much money is being hidden by this man and what he's done all his life. What would they be willing to pay someone to set me up? And yeah, there's a lot to gain. Obviously, the Moodys were excited about this so-called $1 million. Now, if they discredit me and say I was being sexually involved with Stacy, and that's why she's saying the things she was saying, I've now been discredited, and now they can take that away that Scott Moody was not the shooter, which will assist them in getting their inheritance that they feel is coming to them out on 47. And this is when Longo decided to interrupt Stout and ask for clarification. Quote, "Is it your position that if Scott Moody's not the shooter, then somehow his estate is not liable at all?" And Stout said yes, that his estate would be, quote, "a lot less liable." Another juror came forward with a question for Stout and asked him, quote, "Mr. Stout, the problem I'm having is, okay, there's a probability of it coming out, but instead of keeping your partner with you, you take the 16-year-old child on a stakeout." And then Stout went on, some weird rambling about, his partner Brugler wasn't with him when he was with Stacy, that the department had a, quote, "pretty tough summer." Remember, we discussed a little bit about that last week. And there were many weeks where he didn't even contact his partner or see him. And that's when another juror asked, quote, "There wouldn't be any other officers you could have grabbed at the time, knowing you would be with a minor and knowing this girl has done things that really aren't respectable to you?" And Stout again maintained that he just wasn't thinking. He had just gotten lax with his job over the years. That's a great defense. It's not like his job affects other people's lives at all, right? Another juror asked Stout about his handcuffs and if he had ever put them on Stacy. And that's when Stout started, kind of stumbling and stammering through his answer. And tried to say that it was Stacy who first tried to put the cuffs on him, because she's such a jokester. And that he had told her jokingly, quote, "You better stop, et cetera, et cetera. I warned her that she better stop." And then finally he admitted that he did cuff her to his steering wheel, calling it a joke, quote, "screwing around." And another juror then piped up, quote, "So why would you joke and screw around? That just freaks me out that a 15 or 16-year-old's in a car and you, our detective in our sheriff's department, is horsing around with handcuffs. I think those handcuffs are for if you're going to arrest somebody, a criminal, and you stick them in your back seat." Stout just said that, he and this juror obviously live two different lives because his own kids, play with handcuffs all the time. Quote, "My kids got handcuffs on them more than they don't." What? What the hell? What does that mean? And another juror retorted to him, quote, "So that justifies that you can horse around with her and she can sit here and tell us that yes, and he handcuffed me to the steering wheel?" Stout just said that he didn't see anything wrong with this behavior or this action. And obviously that was not swaying the jury. They were not too thrilled with that response. And, Stout noticed this, so he pressed on, quote, "I'm sitting here telling you folks the truth. I can sit and say, nope, I'm sorry, but I didn't handcuff this girl. It didn't happen. But it did. She was horsing around. She is a tease. Do you find it sick that someone calls and says, 'Hi, there's another dead body'? You know what I mean? That's her. That's Stacy Moody. She's ornery, and that's how she acted." And the comment about a dead body was something that Stout had claimed with his testimony, that Stacy had called him not long after the murders and said, "Oh, I found another dead body," and had joked about it and stuff. Like, what? Another juror then replied, quote, I don't know, if I felt uncomfortable with this girl early on, is there someone else you could have referred her to, like children's services, and say, listen, with you being alone with her and the comments that she, the sexual comments she made, I would hope you would be uncomfortable with that. And Stout said that, well, he deals with this stuff every day. Quote, I roll off it. I can handle her making those kinds of remarks. This is a 15-year-old that sleeps with adults. She was with a 19-year-old the night of these homicides. Her mother had sex with a 25-year-old that she's been with. She spent the weekend in Pennsylvania with another adult. Those are things I learned just from these homicides, not from her. We're sitting here, this is a 16-year-old girl that parties almost weekly, and evidently, or instead of saying every weekend, quite often, and was with sexual male partners, adult partners. This is his testimony in front of the grand jury, trying to proclaim his innocence, and he's sitting here slut-shaming a 15-year-old, calling her a tease, and trying to emphasize that oh yeah, she's just a skank or whatever, and she screws adults all the time. It's just wild. And who cares if Kay was sleeping with a 25-year-old? They were, both adults. I would, argue 25 is pretty adult. I didn't think their age gap was that bad. Certainly better than a 36-year-old with a 15-year-old. Another juror then asked Stout, since he knew all of this about Stacy, that she was promiscuous and all this stuff, was he ever tempted by her? And Stout replied, quote, I'm not interested in being with her. Mm-hmm. And the juror who had just asked that question then said, quote, well, that's besides the point. I still feel you put yourself in a bad position. If you were uncomfortable, why couldn't you say, listen, Stacy, I don't really want to do this anymore. I'll set you up with someone at Children's Services where you can become comfortable, because it's apparent she likes older men. And, I know personally I wouldn't put myself in that situation. And I have a daughter that's going to be 14, 15 years old, and I would sure not let her go out with some man on a stakeout at 10, 11 at night. And Stout just said, well, obviously this juror's daughter and Stacy were two different people. Quote, it's about two different people, and I'm glad to say that probably I don't know you as a father, talking to the juror. This girl grew up as a 14, 15-year-old partying and having sexual relations with adults. She's not like your daughter, okay? I can handle these comments. I'm a jokester too. Amazing, isn't it? Amazing. The shit this guy is saying, all it does is just prove his guilt more and more. The jury then questioned Stout how he knew Stacy was so sexually active. How did he know all about this? And Stout replied that Stacy's best friend, a girl named Chrissy Dorsey, allegedly told him, quote, Chrissy says Stacy's been sexually active since she was 12. Another juror asked Stout to confirm that Stacy was indeed drunk at the party that happened the night before the massacre. And at first, Stout said that was correct, but then he interrupted the juror's next question with, quote, Stacy said she was drunk the night of the shooting. As a matter of fact, that reminds me, Stacy stated there was condoms in her bedroom, and she wasn't really sure if she had intercourse. She asked me what Denny said, if they had had intercourse. I wasn't looking for condoms at that homicide. I told her I can check photographs to see if there was condoms up there found, and I told her that Andrew Denny said that they had slept together, had sex, and then she passed out. Isn't that so weird? Dude, nobody asked you about, why are you bringing that up? It's so weird. And when the juror asked if Stout had indeed, done that for Stacy, looked to see if there was condoms, I guess Stout replied in a very bored tone that, no, that's not what he was there for. The juror continued on, hammering Stout with the question, quote, do you recall a conversation with you and your partner about having your partner asking you if you fucked her yet? Can you tell us what that was all about? Now, Stout, tried to play, super dumb, what? What are you talking about? I don't understand. What? He even repeated the question, what? Asked her if I what? And I guess that's when Longo stepped in. Quote, do you recall your partner asking you kind of out of the blue, referencing Stacy, so did you fuck her yet? Do you recall that? Now, of course, Stout said that he didn't recall that. And I guess he sort of stumbled and bumbled his way through the answer, stammering a lot and stuff. And said that oh, well, that didn't sound like Brugler. That didn't sound like his partner. Why would he say that? Plus, this is really silly to me. Plus, Stout was I don't even like the F word, okay? I don't even like saying it. A juror then asked Stout, well, why would Brugler even say that? And Stout said that he didn't know, but he himself was, quote, not like that. And then a juror asked for clarification that this statement, allegedly said by Brugler, was out of character for him. And Stout replied, quote, to have sex with a minor? And juror was no, just the statement. And Stout just responded with, quote, yes, I believe it is. I talk smack, and we're all a bunch of guys, and we talk smack, but I don't recall Mike saying to me, have you, done that to her yet? I guess I should be careful, because I'm not here to tell lies. If he was in a joking manner somewhere, spouting off, saying something like that, that could have been said, but I don't recall that. Another juror then asked Stout, why he and Stacy didn't just, eat in the McDonald's parking lot when they got fast food? Why did he drive like all the way out to the lake every time? And Stout just said, quote, I mean, I can't believe that you folks haven't went back and sat on the island and just watched things going on. And that's when the juror clacked back with, quote, not with a 15-year-old girl. And then Stout just said, quote, well, you're not in my same position. Yeah, that's right. They're not in your position, pedo pig, being put before a grand jury to see if you've done criminal conduct with a 15-year-old girl. Another juror then asked Stout, like, well, okay, if everything Stacy says is a lie, all right, and she's making it up, why wouldn't she say that you full-on assaulted her? You know what I mean? Because, like, Stacy had been upfront and you know, kind of talking about, like, oh, no, I wanted to do it, and he didn't force me, you know, like that. And so this juror was like, okay, if she's full of it, why wouldn't she come out and say that, like, you outright forcibly assaulted her? And then Stout countered, well, there would be evidence of that. And then the juror pointed out, well, like, it was like 2 months later when, like, all this is coming out and all this is being investigated and stuff. And Stout just replied, quote, you're right, I can't answer why Stacy would do anything she does. And this is when Longo stepped in and got Stout to admit that he had investigated, you know, sexual assaults. And then point out to Stout that if you know you have a sexually active teen that has already been sexually active, you wouldn't be able to prove if another man had then like slept with her, you know, like, or forcibly assaulted her. And Longo continued on, quote, in fact, you probably also know that you could have a 4-year-old child sexually penetrated, vaginally penetrated, and chances of having physical evidence from that is almost non-existent in a 4-year-old. Stout said he disagreed with that. And Longo just straight up said, well, quote, you're wrong. And Stout said, well, I may be wrong. And I guess that's when Longo, and I guess he was sort of like in disbelief at this point, said, quote, I know you're wrong. You're telling this grand jury that this sexually active girl who sleeps around with everyone, if you had sex with her, if you, the detective, had sex with her, then everybody would know because of what? What would be the evidence showing that you had sex with her? And then Stout just kind of went on with like a rambling answer. I don't know. I cannot answer why Stacy did what she did or said what she said. I find it peculiar that she said that I performed oral sex on her, not knowing what I do in my own bedroom. And that's one thing I do not do. And there's 2 wives out there, one ex-wife and my wife, that will tell you that. I don't perform oral. The other thing I find peculiar is that I digitally penetrated her while I'm performing this oral, according to what I'm being told, and I was satisfied with that. I am an adult, a male, a person that likes to be sexually gratified also, but this time I'm okay with performing oral on her, but I'm not okay with her performing on me, and that's why we shut it off. But I'm also too embarrassed to let her see my penis, so I have to go around the corner to go pee, so she won't see. That's where her story, I feel, falls apart. What would you actively be thinking right now if you're on this jury? And a juror pointed out to Stout, like, that's exactly where they were getting at. Why wouldn't Stacy just flat out say that Stout full-on assaulted her? And Stout answered, quote, well, maybe it makes her feel dirty that she had sex with an adult. I don't know. Or with myself. I can't answer why she shut the story down at that point in time. I find that one of the peculiar things. I'm surprised I'm also not being accused of forcibly sexually assaulting her. I'm glad, but I find that also odd. What the fuck? What? Unreal. Longo then pointed out that Stacy had told Detective Consolo, remember he was the special investigator that had been hired by the Attorney General's office to investigate Stout and all this, but Stacy had told Detective Consolo that she had no hard feelings against Stout, and that she didn't come forward to, quote, tell on him, you know? I mean, honestly, she came forward because, you know, Audrey overheard that phone call. And it was at this point in time that Stout took the opportunity to disparage the Moodys even more, especially Audrey. He really did not like Audrey. And he said that he believed Audrey was really the driving force behind Stacy's accusations. And then Longo zeroed in on Stout's use of the phrase driving force, pointing out, well, like, you know, if you overheard your own child having a phone conversation like the one Audrey overheard Stacy having with you, and if you then went to someone who could do something about it, or if you made a report, would Stout consider that being a driving force? And Stout, again, just sort of stumbling and bubbling his way through, replied, quote, any mother who took the initiative to listen to telephone calls between whomever and confront her daughter, then I would consider the mother the driving force of this. This phone call, just like when Detective Consolo. Now, I don't know whether there is a phone call recorded between Stacy and anyone, but if you listen to the tape, I immediately confronted him with what he said. What? I love how he's like, oh, well, yeah, Audrey obviously, you know, listened in on, you know, Stacy's conversations and stuff, like putting the onus on Audrey, like she's in the wrong here. No, bro. You are a pedo pig. That is why you're before a grand jury. Stout tried to say that Detective Consola had called him up after interviewing him in person, telling him that he knew it was Stout on this phone call that supposedly had been recorded and Stacy was on the other line. Stout said he knew that this was a lie because no conversation ever took place. He kind of stammered and bumbled his way through his answer some more and said, quote, "How do I know what's recorded at the Moody house and what's not?" And he brought up Steve and Kay's divorce, saying that they used to record each other all the time. So who knows, Steve probably records everything at this point. And he maintained this even after Longo pointed out that, like, dude, the divorce was like more than 10 years ago. And Steve had his own family with like the 3 little boys now. Like, I doubt him and Kay were still doing that. And there really wouldn't be a point for Steve to do that anyway with, Kay now deceased. Longo then moved the conversation to Stacy's fondness of Stout. Quote, "All right, now she's a 15, 16-year-old girl that's kind of got a thing for this detective that's spending time with her. You write little cards to her, you draw a little picture, you call her, and you attend a dance with her. All these things you did. You know you've done them. You've admitted them even to me. Listen to my question. She's got a thing for you. She's confronted on November 2nd by her dad and her stepmom that Audrey overheard a conversation between you and her. And you're telling me that she, who doesn't have a beef with you at all because she likes you, didn't get hold of you and tell you, hey, they're saying that they recorded it, but I know there's no recording. Nothing at all?" And Stout just replied to him, quote, "I'm telling you as God is my witness that I was told on Tuesday this came out. On Friday it was brought to my attention that Stacy wanted to talk to me. I was told on Tuesday that Stacy wanted to talk to me, okay? Are you listening to me?" And I said, "Well, what's going on? What do you need? Is there some problem at home? Something's happened at home? Apparently she needs to talk to me. Okay, I'll shoot over there and find out what's going on." "You better not do that," she says. "They're upset with you. I'm not allowed to see her no more, blah, blah, blah." Okay, that's fine. I tell her if she wants to get a hold of me. She knows how to do it. And I never had contact with her. I can't tell you when was the last contact. It was prior to that Tuesday. And I guess at this point, like, the more he was going on, the more agitated he was becoming. And I guess he was just sort of like speaking really fast and like speaking in run-on sentences with his testimony, and he continued, quote, "Once Chrissy Dorsey told me Stacy had problems at home, she wanted to move out. She did not want to be around these people anymore. They're crazy. She needed to see me immediately. I never talked to her from that point forward, and that's the truth. I have no way of knowing whether that conversation that they claim was recorded, whether any conversations I had with her, her mom, or dad were ever recorded. There's no possible way of me knowing whether it was recorded, okay? This is not CSI. I don't know. The other thing I guess that bothers me is why isn't there any evidence of me and Stacy having all these sexual relations in my car? My car was processed. You folks saw the evidence. If there's excretions coming from her, they should be on the seat or on that backrest or in the back seat or on the floor somewhere. And I'm being advised through my attorney that no evidence was ever found." Now, moving on from Stout's very agitated, very rambling, statement, the questions then turned to when Stacy sat on Stout's lap. Stout, of course, denied that Stacy had ever sat on his lap, denied that she had ever driven his cruiser. And then he talked about a statement that Consolo had told him that he had supposedly made about having a boner. And Stout said that he knew this wasn't true because he hadn't used the word boner since like middle school. And a juror just point blank asked Stout if he at any time had an erection while he was with Stacy. And Stout just replied, quote, No. Apparently my thoughts and her thoughts were two different things. I recognize that she's fond. I'm not sitting here trying to deny. If you think about every part of this story that I've told you, it's the same thing she's saying, other than she's throwing in the sexual contact at children's services. That is absolutely not true. And I guess after his statement, like his answer right here, all the jurors sort of like looked at each other, and then another juror had a question. Quote, I have one. This is bothering me. I guess as a taxpayer and a citizen of Logan County, why would our sheriff's department, no matter how high up the rank you are, ever let any officer of any rank, just take anybody off the street and let them ride around with them in their car and also leave the county and not let them know where you're at and what you're doing? I have a problem with that. And then Stout went on a very long, weird tirade, all right? And just listen to this. Quote, okay, let me explain. As a perk for being a detective, working 17 years and being paid $18 an hour, which I feel is pretty poor being in a position that I'm in. Maybe it was for 20 years ago. I don't know. For 17 years, I've been risking my life and being paid $18 an hour for working 40 hours a week with no overtime. My Nextel phone never stops ringing. I was never off work. It just didn't happen, okay? A 60-hour week was very common, and I was paid for 40. Time off just wasn't, I pretty much lived through the sheriff's office. As a perk, we were permitted to drive a vehicle. It changed sometimes. Sometimes we could drive within the state of Ohio. Sometimes it was within a 5-county radius. Sometimes it was within a 2-county radius. It changed many times. This wasn't even the end of his statement. He went on ad nauseum about all the gas he had put in his cruiser and told the jury that if they were to go out, all right, in Logan County right now, at any given moment, there was someone riding with an officer. It was that common, and it happened all the time. A juror then spoke up, quote, I have an 11-year-old daughter. I can say, hey, you want to see what the sheriff does at night? If so, then I can impress her to the point where she may or may not want to do these things that are in her teenage world. I can go out there and put her in a vehicle with you and say, now, go have a good time. And Stout said, no, not with an 11-year-old. And that's when another juror piped up, oh, but a 15-year-old is okay. And Stout said, yeah, with parental permission. And as they were wrapping up this proceedings, all right, as they were getting ready to wrap it up, a juror then asked Stout about a comment he had made, something about like Sheriff Henry not knowing like what really went on in the sheriff's office, not knowing about like half about what went on there. And the juror wanted Stout to kind of explain this statement. And Stout said that like, Henry did a fine job, but he didn't know how the officers did their job. And then the juror was like, wait a minute, like you don't report to him or report to anybody? And Stout said, well, it was impossible for the sheriff to know every little thing, like who got a DUI and who was brought in for, like public nuisance or something like that. Quote, there's no way to keep up with that. They've got their own responsibilities to deal with, as I have my own responsibilities, and that's what they do. I don't know how else to answer that. And before they concluded, Stout made one last declaration. So after kissing the jury and the court's ass, saying like, oh, he appreciated the opportunity to, tell his story and explain his side, he went on, quote, I guess I've always said that we as law enforcement live in a whole different world than those people outside of it, and I truly feel that way. Not better than, but different, and it's a messed up world. I'm here to tell you folks that I maybe in hindsight made one or two poor decisions. Are those decisions criminal? I don't think so. Yeah. Yeah, having sex with a 15-year-old as a grown-ass adult, yeah, okay. Yeah, nothing criminal about that. And with that, Stout left the stand. Now, in the book I read, this is the next thing it says. Quote, he glanced over his shoulder, taking a sigh of relief. Thank goodness, he said to himself, they didn't ask me about the fixer. And that was, of course, in reference to Stout. Yeah, we'll get a little bit more into who the hell this fixer guy is. Now, it is said after this hearing, all right, Longo and the whole prosecution team just couldn't believe the lies that Stout told. And told poorly. They were really shocked that a detective with that much experience, was such a bad liar. And Longo said that he thought to himself, dude, if Stout is indicative of, the Logan County Sheriff's Office, what other corrupt shit is going on? And Detective Consolo had told Longo after he had concluded his investigation, quote, it will be a long day in hell before I ever return to Logan County. I don't need to have my tires slashed again. Yeah, Detective Consolo had experienced some hostility when he was investigating these allegations and stuff. It is said Longo was really dumbfounded about the whole, Joe Rosebrook angle and why Stout had brought that up. Was he trying to use that as an excuse? That really threw Longo for a loop. Now, the jury, of course, was disgusted and appalled with Stout, so it should come as no surprise that on January 25th, 2006, the grand jury indicted Stout for public indecency, endangering children, interference with custody, contributing to unruliness or delinquency of a minor, and 2 counts of sexual battery. 2 days later, in a packed courtroom, Stout officially pled not guilty, and Logan County Common Pleas Court Judge Mark S. O'Connor released Stout on a recognizance bond with an agreement that he would show up to all his court dates. Now, apparently Stout being indicted was a huge deal in the area, a huge deal for the state, for the county. The local press swarmed all over the area, and those who were already convinced that Scott wasn't the shooter, this was just sort of the final nail in the coffin that they needed. Now, hardly anybody thought that Scott was the shooter. The common belief was that Stout, Sheriff Henry, and the rest of the pedo pigs had rushed to close investigation as soon as possible, and that the real killer was still out there. Now, Stout was ultimately fired from his position as senior detective with the Logan County Sheriff's Office, and he was fired for dishonesty and insubordination because he spent time alone with a girl on 5 separate occasions without his supervisor's knowledge or approval, and on one occasion led the girl's parents to believe that other officers were going to be present at that time. Now, unbeknownst to anyone at the time, Stout reached a settlement that was equal to 3 years' salary with Sheriff Henry in the Sheriff's Office. So in return for $130,000 $35,000 paid out over, several installments. Stout agreed to resign his position and commission and never again seek employment with the Logan County Sheriff's Office. He did not have to surrender his peace officer certification, which meant he could go seek employment with another police department. And we know exactly how the story goes. I guarantee you he had another job within the week. Sure, the pedo pig had no problem at all. Now, the county commissioners, who normally would have had to approve of the settlement, learned of the payments after Sheriff Henry paid Stout from his discretionary account. I don't know if they were saying he was paying Stout's settlement or what, but yeah, they had done some shady shit to try to keep it off the books and away from official eyes. And ultimately, because Stacy refused to testify against Stout, the prosecutor had no choice but to ultimately drop certain charges against Stout. And this was in exchange for Stout pleading guilty to 1 count of attempted child endangering, which was a second-degree misdemeanor. And in May of 2008, Judge David Faulkner sentenced Stout to a measly 90-day jail sentence, suspended 1 year probation, and a $250 fine. Yeah. That's all you have to do if you, sexually assault a minor and you're with the Logan County Sheriff's Office, apparently. And then on July 5th of the same year, guys, so less than 2 months later, Judge Faulkner granted Stout's request to expunge this charge from his record. And he was asking this on the grounds that Stacy never testified against him. And yeah, the judge granted this request, even though Stout had admitted to the charge. Yeah. Yep. Good old boys club. What do you expect? So let's backtrack just a little bit, and we're just gonna get a little bit into Joe Rosebrook. Not too deep or anything, just Rosebrook's connection to Stout and the supposed fixer. So, like we mentioned, Joe was accused and convicted of running a massive chop shop, and I mean massive. He had operatives working all throughout the state of Ohio who would steal cars and parts from shops, dealerships, even right off the street, businesses. And because Joe was very fast and very quick, it was extremely difficult for law enforcement to nail him with anything or gather any evidence from him. And I've heard that when it comes to, the chop shop rings and stuff, because that stuff moves so quickly, right? It's really hard to get a bead on these operations. And apparently, Joe's was massive. And Joe would send parts and cars to far away places all over the country, including Hawaii and to Canada. It was supposedly a multi-million-dollar operation that had been going on for years at this point. And there was an insurance fraud investigator who considered Joe Rosebrook to be the most prolific chop shop king in all of the US. Get this, Joe allegedly raked in $40,000 a month with this operation. Can you a month? A month. There are people who don't even make that in a year. Now, it said the Logan County authorities first got wind of Joe about 20 years prior to the Moody Massacre. So in October of 1983, police had caught up with one of Joe's operatives, one of his buddies. This guy's name was Ray Payne. And when police caught up with Ray, he had stolen goods on him. So when they got him in interrogation, Ray decided to spill everything he knew about Joe's operation. And after this, a flurry of investigations descended upon Joe and his whole ring. And in the end, both Joe and Ray were charged with theft and breaking and entering. Now, Ray, of course, was allowed to take a deal, but Joe was going to take his case to trial. And of course, Ray was going to be the primary witness against him. Now, opening statements for Joe's trial was slated for June 13th, 1984. But on June 11th, 2 days before the trial was to begin, Ray got into his car in his front driveway, turned the key, and was partially blown up by some dynamite that had been placed underneath his van. Isn't that wild? Ray ended up losing his right foot and part of an arm. And though the FBI suspected Joe, there was no evidence, no leads, no witnesses, no nothing that corroborated this, that could prove that Joe had indeed tried to kill Ray. Now, Joe had been known to say, quote, "Anyone who goes to court against me is a dead SOB," but he denied hurting Ray. Quote, "Ray Payne had made a lot of people mad. There are a lot of people that could have done that to him." But Ray, unsurprisingly, blamed Joe. But interestingly enough, many years later, right, in a subsequent interview, Ray said that he no longer blamed Joe. Quote, "What's done is done. It's something I'd rather not talk about." And yeah, because there's no evidence or anything, there was nothing done to Joe. And I think he won his trial in 84. Like, there was, like, no consequences for Joe at this point in time. I don't think he, got charged or anything with Ray's attempted murder. He got off scot-free. Now, Stout investigated the attempted hit on Ray and was actually involved in, like, all the investigations involving Joe. That's how, they came to know each other. Now, Stout said at the time of Ray's attempted hit that it didn't matter who rigged the van, the message was clear. Quote, "You don't talk about Joe Rosebrook." Stout would give countless interviews to the press talking about just how difficult it was to get anything on Joe. And he explained it was primarily difficult to get anything on him because so often witnesses would refuse to talk. Quote, "When we got close to solving something connected to Rosebrook, we'd hear the same thing over and over again. I'm better off alive in jail than out here and dead." It was scary, the influence he had. Steve and Audrey probably thought the same about you, pig. And yeah, as the years went on, all of the local law enforcement, came to know all about Joe Rosebrook. Detective Sergeant Cooper, remember, who had the little shit fit with Dr. Failer, would say that another reason that Joe was hard to pin down was that he did have a local reputation of being sort of like the local Robin Hood. If, someone needed a car part, Joe had it. You needed a car? Joe gotcha. You needed some money? Joe would lend it out. Like, that's how he kind of garnered this reputation among, like, the local community. It was also said that Joe never, quote, fished in his own pond or sold crack on his own corner. So, like, I'm guessing he didn't steal cars and vehicles from, like, Logan County or, like, the local area or something. I'm gonna assume that's what they mean by that. And as the years went by, detectives continued trying to, pin Joe down, get him for something. Sheriff Henry claimed that they asked the federal authorities for help, but, quote, "No one was ever interested." Now, even though, Joe got off on the charges in 84 and, pretty much got away with attempted murder on Ray, Stout still pursued him. And it wasn't until 1999 where the investigation into Joe would take a very serious turn. This turn involved an 18-year-old employee of Joe's, high school dropout Michael Latimer. And towards the tail end of 1999, Michael mysteriously disappeared. So around the time Michael ended up involved with Joe, this was, sometime during 1999, authorities found out about another operation that Joe was running, where he was sending his employees to break into the homes of elderly people who had been sent to, like, retirement homes and stuff, and to steal them of any valuables. Rob them of any valuables. I swear, doing more than one thing is really hard. Now, Michael got caught doing this. Got caught breaking into an elderly person's home who had been, put into a retirement home, and Michael was caught. And Stout was the one who ended up, interrogating Michael. And Stout ended up striking a deal with him. And of course, right, he was hoping that this was going to lead to Joe, right? That's how all these operations go, right? Like, they usually don't go for the small town drug dealers, right? They go for the small town drug dealers in the hopes of getting, like, their supplier going higher up the chain, right? So that's what Stout was hoping to get with Michael. Now, Stout told Michael to just go home, just shut up, and no one would know that he was caught, all right? No one would know. But, of course, somehow, some way, Joe did find out that Michael had been caught, and he suspected that Michael had talked to Stout. So the police found out that Joe was aware Michael had been caught, so then they arrested Michael, thinking that they could keep him safe in custody. But on November 23rd, 1999, after posting bond, Michael visited his grandmother, Donna Huffman, and she said while her grandson was at her home visiting her, he got a call from Joe. Donna said it was very obvious her grandson did not want to go meet up with Joe. Joe called him and wanted to meet up with him, but Michael relented and decided to go meet up with Joe anyway. She said she overheard them talking about some sort of like a truck deal, and Michael was supposedly last seen getting into Joe's car near the post office that was near Donna's house. And 2 days later, Michael missed the Thanksgiving meal at the family home, and his mom said, quote, "He wasn't a bad kid, but I had a bad feeling from the very beginning when he started running with Rosebrook and some of those guys. I don't know what happened, but I don't think he's ever coming back." And like with Ray's case, though the police highly suspected Joe, there was no evidence. There was nothing to prove it, They had nothing. But that did not stop Stout from continuing to pursue Joe. And then finally, after years of investigating him, in 2002, Logan County prosecutor Gerald Heaton finally had enough evidence to charge Joe with racketeering. Joe was put on house arrest ultimately, and while he was under house arrest, he hired a man named Daniel Ott, and he paid Dan $2,000 with the promise of $15,000 more if Dan killed a certain fellow. Now you're probably thinking this certain fellow was Stout. No. This certain fellow that Joe wanted Dan to kill was, according to Joe, the town scum, and was known locally as the Logan County Sheriff's Office's fixer. And it was said this fixer covered up all of the piggy's crimes. This fixer also allegedly worked very close with Stout. They were very, very good buds. Like they were very tight bros. Now, ultimately, Joe would end up pleading guilty to the racketeering, and in a jailhouse interview, Joe admitted that he ultimately called off the hit. He called off the hit on the fixer. In the interview, he said, quote, "My family was being threatened, and I thought they were in danger. It was a stupid mistake. I didn't want to go through with it." Now, in a separate sting operation, the police caught up with Dan, who, as you can guess, worked for multiple people just like Joe. Yeah, apparently he worked for a lot of different chop shops, getting them, supplies, parts, whatever they needed. He was like the chop shop guy. And I think Dan may have told the police additional information about Joe's operation. And by this time, as you can guess, Joe absolutely loathed Stout, because it was Stout who was usually leading the charge in investigating Joe and trying to get him on something. So as you can guess, Joe was not a huge fan of Stout. He was annoyed that Stout had constantly put up flyers of Michael and bringing attention to his disappearance. He had constantly investigated Joe and anyone who had any type of connection with him. And so, yeah, by this time, Joe had just grown to outright hate this guy. Hated Stout. So, while behind bars, Joe decided to hire that private investigator we discussed, Gary Phillips, to check Stout out. Follow him around, see if he couldn't get something on Stout. Now, I don't know how exactly Joe found out. I guess it's not too much of a stretch to think that, he had multiple contacts everywhere in Logan County. Someone probably told him, but Joe found out that Stout had a John Deere backhoe that had been recently stolen out of Union County, sitting in his backyard on his property. Now, when Joe, of course, found out about this, he informed Investigator Phillips, who then went out to Stout's property, found the backhoe, and proceeded to take photos. He then brought those photos to the Union County Sheriff's Office, and he also filed a report. He then proceeded to inform one of the sheriffs where they could find the stolen backhoe. So after his visit, the Union County Sheriff then called up Sheriff Henry and, just told him everything that had just happened. And before Phillips could return to Logan County, someone saw the fixer driving that same stolen backhoe down the road to his own shop, which was located in Ridgeway, which was in northeastern Logan County. Now, I guess Investigator Phillips at some point confronted Stout with this, straight to his face. And Stout claimed, of course, that he didn't steal it. He had borrowed the backhoe from Don Hayes, who was from West Mansfield. Phillips, of course, then went to interview Don, who told Phillips, quote, "Bullshit, my backhoe was stolen." Joe said after this, he then got threats behind bars from the fixer, who said if either he or Stout got in trouble for the stolen backhoe, he would kill Joe's family in front of him and then kill Joe himself. Quote, "And guess what? Stout would be an investigating officer and would determined that Rosebrook had shot his family and then had committed suicide." Yeah, that's what Joe was saying the fixer had told him. It's you either keep your mouth shut, and if Stout or I get in trouble for the stolen backhoe, I'm gonna kill your family and then you, and I'm gonna stage it as a murder-suicide. That's definitely interesting. Now, Joe said that he was scared shitless at this point, all right? And think about, assuming this is all, real, think about how intense that is. Joe Rosebrook is a scary enough guy as it is. He has his own power, right? But Joe was saying this call, these threats from the fixer, really scared him. Just really freaked him out. Joe told law enforcement officers about the fixer's threats, saying that, he even said this in front of witnesses in Joe's driveway. There were witnesses who heard this threat. Now, the same day that these threats supposedly came from the fixer, Phillips was in court in Logan County, and this was for, a whole other case. He just happened to be in court. And when he got back to his car that same day, he found a Logan County Sheriff's Office card with the name ripped off underneath his windshield wiper on his windshield, along with a sticker that looked like a bullet hole. And there was another one of these stickers on the driver's side as well in the driver's side window. And yeah, this led to nowhere. Like, the FBI could only get a partial print off the card, and there was nothing else to point to, like, who had done this. Yeah, very interesting, right? So in April of 2005, Joe was ultimately sentenced to 10 years behind bars, and it was for conspiracy to commit aggravated murder, receiving stolen property, obstruction of justice, and to conceal or alter a motor vehicle's identity. So after all this time, they finally got Joe Rosebrook, got him for 10 years. But Joe had his supporters, including his friends and family, of course. They even, like, took out ads in the local paper with stuff that read, like, stuff like, quote, thinking of you, believing in you, and, you know, all that kind of stuff. Joe's wife, Anne, maintained that her husband ran a legitimate business, fixing up cars and selling them. And Joe's adult daughter, Penny, said that years of police aggression had taken a toll on her father, and she herself had to move out of Logan County because she felt threatened by Stout. Now, from behind bars, Joe claimed that Stout had gotten an inmate to tell him that if anyone from the sheriff's office got in trouble about that stolen backhoe, Stout would bury Joe's daughter 100 feet from Michael Latimer's grave, as well as Joe's other child. So I guess Joe was trying to insinuate that Stout had actually killed Michael? Like, who's to say if, yeah, what Joe is saying here is even real? Like, I don't think Stout killed Michael. I think that's silly. But when Joe read the headlines about Stout being indicted about what he did to Stacy, he thought to himself, if Stout and the Fixer would kill people over a stolen backhoe, what would they do if Stout faced these kinds of charges? So yeah, that was like the Joe Rosebrook connection. I guess that's how Stout felt like he played a role in all this. Yeah, just some very interesting stuff and tidbits, right? So going back to the Moody's, let's get a little bit into these wrongful death lawsuits. We've mentioned this a couple times, right? Megan and Paige's family were suing Scott's estate for wrongful death. And since Steve was the executor of his son's estate, this was his problem to deal with. And, you know, what Stout said on the stand was, you know, correct. They did have a vested interest in proving Scott wasn't the shooter because, you know, they didn't want to be held liable for, you know, these deaths. Because if they could prove that another shooter, or at least, like, there was enough evidence to prove that Scott wasn't the shooter, Scott's estate would be found, you know, not to be liable. But the only thing they had was Stacy's eyewitness testimony about that older man with the short gray hair and the blue t-shirt. Now, the book said the Moody's exhausted every other avenue that they could before they resorted to hypnotism. I know. Are y'all thinking of the Candy Montgomery case? That's exactly what I thought of when I heard this. No, apparently, some courts will allow a witness's recollection to be refreshed with hypnotism, and their testimony will be admissible only if the trial court determines that, under the totality of the circumstances, the testimony is found to have merit, right? So it's not purely this hypnotic testimony. It has to be in conjunction with other stuff, right? Now, the party offering the hypnotic testimony, so in this case the Moody's, had the burden of showing by clear and convincing evidence the reliability of that hypnotic testimony. And in order to do this, all right, because they knew they were going to have a bunch of hurdles against this, right? Like, because what do you think when you hear, like, hypnotism or whatever? You're like, kind of eye roll a little bit. So they decided to try to find the best experts in the hypnotism field that they could. And on March 6th, 2009, Stacy had a session with two of the state's best experts in hypnotism. It was Douglas Wells and Philip Osborne, and they worked with Forensic Consultants Incorporated. I guess the men had more than 30 years experience working with the Ohio Highway Patrol, and their session with Stacy would last approximately an hour, so not too long of a session. Now, in this session, Stacy did not add any further details than what she had given to Dr. Failer way back when, and under hypnosis, she said she didn't really see a whole lot because of how dark it was, but she did see a gun in her face and a man who had short gray hair. When asked if she knew the man, she said no, that he had a blue t-shirt on, and he was no one that she had ever seen before or since. She said after the gun fired, she got up, went to her mother's room, and that she never saw the man with the gun again. She didn't know where he had gone. She just knew that she never saw him again. But ultimately, this testimony from Stacy's would never enter a courtroom because it wouldn't be needed. So Mark Harshbarger was, you know, Paige's father, and he was the executor of her estate. So, you know, it was kind of him leading the charge in filing this wrongful death lawsuit, along with his lawyers, of course. And this is when Steve hired Rob St. Clair, who was a probation litigation attorney and who worked out of Columbus, to represent, you know, him in this lawsuit. And again, remember, Rob St. Clair is also the author of the book that I read. So right after the murders, a probate court judge ordered the conversion of all the life estates called for in Wilma's will, and he wanted them all converted to cash, which meant, of course, ordering the sale of a bunch of farmland and real estate. And after more than 100 years, the farm was finally going to be out of the family, which is kind of sad. But since conventional sales of real estate, rental properties, and all that stuff, like, took a lot of time, the judge ordered it all to be sold via auction because, like, he wanted to get this done quick. It had gone on long enough, and he just wanted to settle it. So after all was said and done, and all the taxes were paid, the remaining assets and money were then transferred to Cheryl's estate. And her will left most of her property to her husband, Gary, and vice versa. And then both of, their assets and money and stuff were then transferred to Kay's estate. And through her parents' estates, Kay inherited one half of Wilma's original estate. And the other half had gone towards establishing that foundation and scholarship that Wilma had called for in her will. Kay's house was sold via auction along with her goods. We talked about that in last week, remember, with the baby spoons. And finally, after all of that was said and done, Kay's will stipulated that all her assets be left to Scott and Stacy, split 50-50. So 50% of Kay's estate, which was now worth several $100,000, was then transferred to Stacy, and the other half was transferred to the estate of Scott. Now, Stacy had a legal court-appointed lawyer to represent, like, her interest in, like, the will and in, like, the financial aspect and all that. And this attorney was Paul Cormanick, and he tried to argue in court that, like, Scott's estate shouldn't even get any of the inheritance. I don't know if he was trying to get it all transferred to Stacy or what, but he was arguing that, like, Scott shouldn't get any inheritance because of Ohio's Slayer statute, which, just prevents criminals from profiting from their crimes. But, St. Clair and, his team argued that, well, that doesn't count here because Scott was never convicted in a court of law, never officially charged or convicted of doing this, so that shouldn't even be at play. And in the end, the judge ruled in Scott's estate's favor, and his estate got half of Kay's will. And that is when the wrongful death suits had been brought forth. And in the end, Scott's estate did end up winning both of these wrongful death lawsuits, but it wasn't, because they proved their case. It was on a technicality. So Mark Harshberger, Paige's father, and his lawyers hadn't filed some sort of, paperwork or something in a timely manner. And that was what a lot of the court battle was about, was, when did this timeline start? Because, Mark's lawyers were saying, well, the timeline started here, so we're well within the statute of limitations or whatever. Whereas, Rob St. Clair, representing Steve, was arguing like, oh no, the timeline started here, so they're outside of it. And in the end, the courts ruled in the Moody's favor. And this was after the parties went to a summary judgment, where, like, everything is put before the judge and then they make the final decision. And there was a lot of details about, like, the Harshbarger's suit against the Moody estate. There wasn't really anything about Megan's estate, though. This is all the book says about it. Quote, the probate court had already said no, rejecting the claim as not timely filed, which left Harshbarger with no recourse against Scott Moody's estate. The probate court judge had ordered that the claims filed by Paige Harshberger's estate and Megan Caruso's estate be dismissed. And then the common pleas court also ruled in this way as well. So I don't know if it was the same thing with Megan's estate. They didn't file some paperwork in a timely manner. I don't know. But it is said that Steve Moody was actually kind of disappointed that, like, this was how the lawsuit was won on a technicality. It is said he was really, really, like, anxious to prove in a court of law that his son could not have been the shooter, or at the very least, there was a possibility that someone else could be, And it is said that he was, like, really disappointed. It's just like, that's great, we won, that's awesome, but, like, I don't get to prove, in public, in a court of law, that Scott, didn't do this. And this is kind of really where the book ends a little bit, and there were many, many questions that the book, kind of listed out, and some questions that I had, that even after all is said and done, there's still so many things left to be unanswered. So one of the things the book asked was, like, is Brett or Andrew incorrect in their telling? Remember, Andrew said that he left the house about 7 a.m., and he saw Brett sleeping on the couch. But Brett said he left at 6 a.m. He knew he left at that time because he looked at his cell phone, and Andrew's truck was still in the driveway. And, the book was asking, like, oh, who's wrong? Did Andrew see someone on the couch? Who was it? And, personally, I think Andrew was just completely mistaken, personally. Another question was, like, okay, Gary and Cheryl were, like, super religious about locking up their house. How the hell did the killer get in? And how/why did they lock up leaving? Because remember, remember, the police had to force their way into Gary and Cheryl's home where they found him. You know, they're asking, did the killer lie in wait for Gary and Cheryl? Could Scott have entered the home while they were out, outside milking, grabbed the gun and waited and lied in wait for his grandparents? Was he the one who put their dog in a back room and locked it in there? Dave Cusick said he was not at that party Saturday night. Remember Dave Cusick? That was one of Kay's boyfriends who, it is said, ran a pretty large, marijuana ring. He was like a drug dealer. But I guess Brett, at one point in time, told Nikki that he saw Dave Cusick there. And so the book asked, was Dave at that party? Was Brett confusing Jason for Dave? That's personally what I think about that. Why did Brett say this to Nikki super later? Why didn't he say this in his interview with police? Was Scott's wound behind the ear a contact wound or not? Apparently there was still some debate left up in the air about that. But even though there's, debate about it being a contact wound, there are still questions. Could Scott have killed himself the way the police said he did? And what was with those blood streaks at the top of the bed that were described as railroad tracks? What the hell was up with those? Was Scott indeed shot while he was sleeping and then dragged to the bottom of his bed and someone put his hand around the gun and then shot himself a second time to stage the suicide? Why didn't the police test that blood? Would Scott even be capable of shooting himself a second time after the first shot? And this was another question that I had too. If everyone was shot in their sleep, how come no one woke up at all? No one, after the first shot or two, no one woke up. If Scott was indeed the shooter, why were his socks so clean? Why was he found with jeans and no belt, which, apparently was very unusual for him? Why did he only dress in jeans? And even if we say he murdered his grandparents and then undressed himself before killing everyone else, how did he not track mud throughout the house? Remember, they found his work boots and there was a bunch of mud on them. So, was he wearing the boots when he shot everyone? If he was, how did he not track mud everywhere? Was he in his socks when he murdered everyone? If so, why were they so clean? Did he change socks before killing himself? And if so, why? And speaking about the muddy work boots, the police also never tested the mud on those work boots. Surely there'd be some way to test and see if that mud was fresh or something, right? Where did the murder weapon come from? No one seems to know. The police say it was Gary's, but Gary's brother is adamant he did not own a .22 rifle, and if he had a rifle, he would never have bought a used one. There were rumors that the weapon had come from the Stout gun shop, who, remember, was specialized in doing shady illegal shit, not maintaining proper paperwork, selling and dealing stolen weapons and stuff. Could it have come from there? Could Stout have given his fixer friend the gun? Who knows? And we mentioned this in part 1. There were footprints in the dust near Kay's headboard of her bed. Why weren't those footprints ever tested or at least compared to Scott's just for verification? Why is so much stuff not tested? Why was Scott's DNA and tissue the only one found on the murder weapon? Why wouldn't at least one other person's tissue or DNA or something be on the weapon? Especially when a lot of the shots were close contact wounds. Did Scott wipe the gun clean before he killed himself? And if he did, why? Stacy said that she heard 2 gunshots, then was shot, then heard 2 more shots, and then didn't hear any more after that. But shouldn't she have heard 2 more after she had been shot a second time, and those should have been the shots, that Scott had done to kill himself? Maybe she was too out of it after being shot the second time to hear those last 2 shots? Who knows? Could she just be mistaken in, her recollection? I mean, there was a lot going on. She was shot in the frickin' face and neck. I think it'd be understandable if she couldn't remember everything quite concisely and clearly, right? How was Scott, who wasn't a marksman, wasn't a shooter, able to so methodically kill everyone? There was no wasted shots. Who knew the most effective way to kill someone was behind the ear? Did Scott know that? Did he practice target shooting in secret? But even if he did, wouldn't have police found some sort of evidence in his room of that? And if Scott did indeed do this, what could have set him off? Remember, we talked about this before. That was one of the things that was baffling experts, is he just did not exhibit the telltale signs or behaviors that most mass or spree killers exhibit. There were, the accusations of Scott being angry and mouthy and stuff like that. But if what we heard about Gary is true, maybe they just kind of suffered from, I don't know, like bipolar or some sort of mood disorder or something, something that was explainable. In doing this case, I ran across a lot of old school message boards and people who said that they lived in the area and they had thoughts about it. And I remember one comment said yeah, we knew Scott had a temper around here. He could definitely get set off, but nothing like this, nothing to the degree that you would think he was a killer. And then remember, we only had a little brief mention of this when the police interviewed Scott's ex-girlfriend, Amanda Arthur. In the only handful recent days before the shooting, Scott had a hernia and he had a surgery to correct it, and he couldn't do farm work for a few days. And they were asking in the book, if he had just had this hernia surgery, how was he able to do all this? He couldn't even do farm work. And what about the police scanner calls about this man running in the airport? Remember, a couple of people had heard that? Was that just a completely separate, unrelated story? Was it the real shooter, the real killer? Was it the fixer? There were other witnesses who were driving on the highway during this time who said that they did see a man running from the direction of Kay's home, and this was not Jeff, who, remember, was Nikki's boyfriend, and he dashed across the highway to get the address when they were calling 911. They already confirmed that it wasn't Jeff. And so the question is, who the hell was that? Was that the killer that these people saw? Was it just someone unrelated? And real quick, let's talk just briefly about this fixer, all right? We've heard so much about this fixer, all right? Who is this fixer? Now, the book doesn't outright call this man the fixer. I don't know if it's to avoid lawsuits or something, I'm not sure. But this man that they call Kurt was supposedly a wannabe cop, and was supposedly buddies with all the good old boys at the Logan County Sheriff's Office, particularly Stout. I said this earlier. They were super tight bros. Now, in the book, there's a very short chapter, and it involves a phone call that had come into the Logan County Sheriff's Office on Saturday, May 28th, 2005, the day before the massacre. There was apparently nobody really at the sheriff's office. It was a long holiday weekend and stuff, and so Kurt was at the sheriff's office when this phone call came in, and so he took it. The phone call was for Sheriff Henry, but he was out. So Kurt took a message. And then after that, I think Sheriff Henry, along with some sheriff's deputies, walked in. And in the book, it says Kurt told them, quote, "Boy, you're not going to believe that phone call," he said to two deputies walking in from the break room. "Some farmer out on 47 wants to see Sheriff Henry right away. Said he's pissed. He just found out that you lowly road warriors have been out at the high school having sex with his granddaughter and her friends, threatening to arrest those girls unless they went along with it." The two deputies looked at each other, concerned. This could turn into something serious. One of them said, "Did he mention anything about drugs?" The fixer looked down at his notes. "Schaefer, 592-3058. Yeah, he sure did. He said someone's going to jail. Wait till Stout hears about this." So yeah, okay, this is when we get into some rumors, all right? Some conspiracies. So remember how I said in last week in part 3 that it was sort of known, especially among the local high schoolers, about the perverted road warriors and all that? Well, apparently there were so many rumors flying around. One of those rumors was that Gary Schaefer had gotten wind of what the cops had been doing out there and found out that Stacy was involved or something. And so that's when he called the sheriff's office, and that's what I just read to you. Now, there were rumors that Stout had been messing around with Stacy before all this and before we went into. There were also rumors that Scott found out that Stout had been messing with his sister and wanted heads to roll and was going to bring it up the chain and get people in trouble. There were additional rumors that Stout was actually messing around with Kay before the massacre. And there were also rumors that Stout and Dave Cusick were actually in on this drug ring together. I think it was mainly marijuana, but those were the other rumors that I saw that people were talking about in the area. That that was one of the reasons Stout had so many drug busts in his record, was that him and Cusick worked together to sort of squash their competition, and that they ran drugs together. So yeah, so many rumors. Who knows what's true? Who knows what's completely, false? Who knows? But it is said that Stout and this Kurt guy, this fixer, whoever, are very good friends to this day. Now, in the book, Rob St. Clair claims that after all the work they had done, including consultations with ex-FBI agents, they are pretty sure, 99.9% sure they know who the shooter is. But unfortunately, the FBI has refused to reopen the case, saying that it's a state matter. And the Ohio Attorney General's office has also declined to reopen the case, saying that there's not enough evidence to point to someone else being the shooter. I don't know how you could come to that conclusion after everything we've talked about these last few weeks, but whatever. Maybe they meant on a legal standard, Now, the book, Rob St. Clair in the book puts out his own kind of theory, posits his own theory about what could have possibly led to the massacre. And the book theorizes that Gary Schaefer found out about, either through Kay or wherever, about like what was going on at the high school and the cops, right? What they were doing. And he became enraged and wanted to have a meeting with Sheriff Henry because he wanted heads to roll. And, this would mean, of course, careers would be on the line. Questions would be asked. Who knows what kind of skeletons would come out? It would be a huge, scandalous investigation, would of course leave the sheriff's office with a huge black eye, regardless of the outcome. And this is what the book posits and theorizes is what led to the massacre. And they theorize that this massacre was perpetrated by the fixer helping to clean up his Betty's mess, and it was covered up by the Logan County Sheriff's Office. So what do y'all think about that? I think there's definitely a lot of evidence to at least warrant reopening the investigation. And real quick, before we end it, let's get a little bit into Stacy and how her life panned out. So Stacy ended up growing up and moving on with her life and really diving into her faith. She really became like a hardcore Christian. She graduated from a Midwestern Bible college and she got a bachelor's degree. I'm not sure in what. And she waited tables to pay her way through school. On top of working in the school's bursar's office as a file clerk. And while she was in school, Stacy met her future husband, Rick. And the two ended up married and they now have 2 sons together. And I said Stacy lives a relatively quiet, normal life. She lives with her family somewhere in western rural Pennsylvania. And unfortunately, she is said to be estranged from her father and stepmother and does not have any meaningful contact with anyone in Logan County. Sheriff Henry ended up stepping down and not seeking re-election when his term was up. And remember Police Chief Ron Murray, who had kind of alerted Steve to some questions and inconsistencies that he saw? Well, at 41 years old, on April 3rd, 2011, Chief Murray passed away unexpectedly at home. He was found unresponsive, and the coroner stated that his cause of death was a brain aneurysm, but no autopsy was ever performed. And to this day, there are those, including some of Murray's friends, who insist he was poisoned and killed, and perhaps poisoned and killed for bringing all this stuff to Steve Moody's attention. I don't know what to think about that, but yeah, that is definitely one of the conspiracy theories going out there. And that, ladies and gents, was the Moody Massacre. Oh my God, what do you guys think? What do you think? Personally, my own opinion, I think there is definitely enough evidence and questions and information to warrant at least reopening the investigation. I personally do not believe Scott did this. Even before I read the book and I was reading the newspaper articles, and when that information came out about Scott's autopsy that he shot himself twice, and then they described like the shots and the wounds and where the bullets were, I immediately raised an eyebrow and I was like, wait a minute, what? I get that it's rare and it can happen that people shoot themselves twice, but it just didn't make sense. And then when I, read the book and read Murray's summation of the whole thing, I was like, damn, yeah, that doesn't make any sense. Plus, when you look up the murder weapon, look how big and long that gun is. Come on, dude, someone's really gonna shoot themselves like this? Not to mention, wouldn't you think the common thing would be in the mouth or this, or well, I guess you couldn't do that with that long rifle, but still, it's just weird, right? Yeah, I don't think Scott did this. Personally, I think there's a lot of stuff to point to this fixer person and the Logan County Sheriff's Office. Apparently it's a known fact that they are corrupt. And actually in the preface of the book here, the Saving Stacy book that I read, it even, there's quotes and headers of all the chapters. And in the preface, the very first one, it opens with, if you want to commit murder and get away with it, do it in Logan County, Ohio. And this is something that Paul Harvey said on his radio show. So yeah, it's definitely seems to be a pretty accepted fact that the Logan County Sheriff's Office is very corrupt. And frankly, that is why it should be a bigger deal when cops and people in authority do stuff like this. The shit with Stout, because of what he did to Stacy, I would argue that every case he ever worked on now needs to be re-examined. And that is why when pigs abuse their power and people in authority don't do their job and all that shit, that is why we need to take it seriously. Because now I feel like anyone that Stout prosecuted could come out and say oh, well, look at all these lies. Look, he did this and that and the other. You know what I mean? It raises questions, particularly questions regarding his credibility, right? Yeah, I don't know. I think there's I definitely lean towards the fixer theory. And one of the things that kind of made me start believing it was, again, I mentioned this earlier, there's a lot of like old message boards out there and stuff that you can find online of like people talking about this case when it happened. You can find Reddit threads and like people who, claim that they're from Logan County. Like, I get it, it's online, you can say you're whoever, but everyone was saying like, oh, I'm a local, oh, hey, I lived here my whole life, whatever. And they were all saying the same thing. Like, oh, no, this fixer guy, no, it's real. It's real. There's real corruption out here, and Scott Moody did not do this massacre. I don't know. It was pretty wild. I don't know. Please tell me, what do you guys think? Do you think Scott Moody did this massacre? Why do you think that? I would love to know one way or the other. Like, why do you think? Why do you think he did not? I definitely think there's a lot of compelling evidence to point to someone else committing these murders. And it's just kind of sad that poor Scott's memory, he's labeled like a murderer, but at least there is a good chunk of people that question that. So I don't know, at least there's that. It's a shame that's what his memory is, it's really sad. And I am glad that Stacy was able to, grow up and move on and have a family. So I was like, oh, good for her. I'm so glad, because like no one should have to go through a quarter of what she has had to go through, Well, I'm going to end it there. Thank you so much to Smash the Bug for pointing me in this case. Real quick, last plug. This is the Saving Stacy book that I read. If you are also interested in kind of going into way more elaborate detail, because obviously I couldn't read the whole book to you, go ahead and pick this up. It's definitely interesting and has a lot of questions that I'm like, yeah, why isn't this answered? That is a good question. And brought up questions that I had reading the newspaper articles too. All right, well, we will be back next week with a whole new case. Until then, I hope you stay safe and happy out there. Take care of yourself. Remember, don't be a dick. Leave a little sparkle wherever you go. Alrighty, guys, thank you so much for hanging out with me and for dealing with my flakiness. So sorry. I will see you guys next week. Bye-bye.